There are moments when a soul reaches the edge of its long road and does not yet realize it has arrived. You may still feel the dust on your feet, the ache in your back, the quiet suspicion that another hill waits just ahead. For years, perhaps for most of your life, you have learned to expect resistance as naturally as breath. Trouble has become so familiar that peace feels foreign, almost suspicious. And yet, what if the struggle you have rehearsed for so long has already been answered? What if the very weight you carry is proof that the sentence has been written, signed, and sealed beyond your sight? We are tempted to believe that suffering continues because we have failed some hidden test, missed some secret instruction, or disappointed heaven by being too weak, too slow, too human. But this is not how the deeper story usually works. The longest battles are rarely punishments, they are preparations. The iron is not struck because it is worthless, but because it is chosen for strength. The night does not linger because the dawn is uncertain, but because the eyes must be trained to recognize light when it finally breaks. If you are listening to these words and something in you stirs, quietly, cautiously, it may be because you have sensed a change without being able to name it. The old patterns no longer wound you in the same way. The accusations that once thundered now arrive like echoes in an empty room. You still feel the memory of pain, but it no longer defines the future in quite the same manner. This is often how endings begin. Not with fireworks, but with a subtle loosening of chains you have worn so long that their absence feels strange. A chosen soul is not one spared from hardship, but one who is trusted with it. Selection is not announced with applause, it is revealed through endurance. The world looks at scars and calls them damage, but heaven reads them as signatures. Every delay you endured, every door that closed without explanation, every season where prayer felt like shouting into silence, none of it was wasted. Silence itself can be a form of speech, especially when it teaches patience, discernment, and the courage to remain faithful without immediate reward. There is a difference between a struggle that continues because it must, and one that lingers only because the heart has not yet accepted its release. Many remain bound not by opposition but by expectation, expecting pain because pain is all they have known. Yet when heaven seals a chapter, it does not always tear the page from your hands. Sometimes it waits for you to notice that the ink has dried, that no new sentences are being added, that the story has quietly moved on while you were still rereading old lines. Consider how often the greatest transformations arrive disguised as ordinary moments, a conversation that does not wound you as before, a fear that rises but no longer commands, a door that opens without struggle, almost shyly, as if it had been waiting for permission. These are not coincidences, they are signals. Not every miracle shouts. Some whisper, trusting that those who have suffered deeply have learned to listen closely. The sealing of a chapter does not mean the memory disappears. It means the authority of that season has ended. The past may speak, but it no longer holds the pen. What once tried to define you now stands behind you, unable to follow where you are being led. This is why resistance often intensifies just before release, not because it is winning, but because it knows its time is short. You may still question whether you deserve such an ending, whether rest is allowed after such long warfare. But deserving has never been the measure. Completion is. When a task has accomplished its purpose, it is set down, not argued with. Heaven is remarkably practical in this way. It does not prolong pain for drama, nor delay freedom for spectacle. When the lesson is learned, when the character is formed, when the heart is ready, the seal is placed. And so, if you find yourself standing in a strange quiet, no longer chaste as before, no longer broken as easily, no longer afraid in quite the same way, do not rush to fill the silence with old fears. You may be standing at the threshold where struggle ends not with defeat, but with fulfillment, where the final chapter closes not because you gave up, but because the story required nothing more from suffering to carry you forward. A chosen soul is not marked by comfort but by capacity. From the beginning, the weight placed upon you was never random, never excessive by mistake. It was measured, precise, and intentional, though it rarely felt that way while you were carrying it. Others may have been spared the intensity you endured, not because they were less loved, but because they were entrusted with less. Strength is not assigned equally, it is distributed according to purpose. And purpose, when it is significant, demands a depth that can only be carved by resistance. You were not thrown into difficulty to see whether you would survive, but to see what kind of depth would be formed within you while you did. Each delay taught discernment. Each disappointment trained restraint. Each unanswered prayer refined sincerity, stripping away the desire for spectacle and leaving behind a quieter, truer faith. You learned to stand without applause, to continue without reassurance, to obey without explanation. These are not lessons given to the many. They are reserved for those whose future requires steadiness rather than speed. Here were seasons when it seemed as though effort produced no visible fruit, when obedience felt inefficient and patience appeared unrewarded. Yet unseen growth is often the most decisive. Roots are never admired, but without them, nothing stands. While others celebrated quick results, you were being anchored. While others were elevated early, you were being established deeply. What looks like delay from the outside is often reinforcement from above. A chosen one is not exempt from doubt. In fact, doubt often walks closer to those who care most deeply about truth. You questioned because you wanted to be certain. You wrestled because you refused to live on borrowed conviction. Even your struggles of belief were not betrayals. They were evidence of engagement. Indifference would have been easier, but you were never built for ease. You were built for clarity, and clarity is forged through honest struggle rather than shallow certainty. The resistance you encountered was rarely proportional to your actions, and that confused you. Small steps met with outsized opposition. Quiet obedience provoked unexpected obstacles. This is because threat is measured not by noise, but by potential. What you carried was never obvious to the casual observer, but it was recognized in realms you could not see. Opposition does not arise merely to stop movement. It arises to prevent arrival. And arrival, in your case, has always been the concern. You may have noticed that certain temptations lost their appeal over time, not because they vanished, but because your appetite changed. You outgrew what once distracted you. You learned that some doors close not as punishment, but as protection. Not every opportunity is an invitation, and not every loss is a setback. Discernment sharpened quietly within you, teaching you when to move and when to remain still, when to speak and when silence carried greater authority. This capacity you carry is not loud. It does not demand attention. It does not rush to be recognized. It waits. It observes. It holds. That is why you have often been misunderstood. People expect power to announce itself, to dominate, to impress. But the kind entrusted to you is stabilizing rather than spectacular. It steadies environments. It calms chaos. It restores order without needing credit. Such strength is rare, and rarity is always costly. You were shaped to endure complexity without becoming bitter, to see flaws without surrendering hope, to face injustice without losing integrity. These qualities do not emerge by accident. They are the result of sustained pressure applied over time, pressure that would have fractured a different vessel. The fact that you are still standing, still listening, still willing to believe despite what you have seen, speaks more loudly than any public victory ever could. Heaven does not choose recklessly. It does not invest deeply where return is uncertain. What has been placed within you has survived fire, silence, delay, and doubt. It has not been diluted by comfort, nor destroyed by disappointment. That endurance is the evidence. Capacity is revealed not when everything is working, but when nothing is, and something within you refuses to collapse. There were long stretches when silence felt heavier than hardship. Pain at least announces itself. It explains why the heart aches. Silence offers no such clarity. It leaves room for imagination. And imagination, when wounded, is rarely kind. You spoke, you asked, you waited, and what answered you was stillness. Not the peaceful kind at first, but the unsettling quiet that makes one wonder whether words are reaching anywhere at all. Many mistake this silence for absence, but absence does not shape character the way this did. What you encountered was not neglect, but restraint. Silence is often the language used when a soul must mature beyond dependence on constant reassurance. If every step had been narrated, if every fear had been immediately soothed, your strength would have remained borrowed rather than owned. You learned to move without hearing applause from heaven, to choose rightly without feeling immediately affirmed. This is a severe mercy. It strips away the habit of acting only when comfort is guaranteed, and replaces it with a steadier obedience that does not require emotional reward. In those quiet seasons, motives were exposed. You were forced to confront why you believed, why you hoped, why you continued at all, when nothing external forced your faith. You discovered whether it had roots or merely momentum. Many abandon the path at this point, not because it is false, but because it no longer feeds the ego. You remained, even when belief felt thin and effort felt unseen. That endurance was not passive, it was an act of trust refined to its purest form. Silence also taught you to listen differently. When grand answers did not arrive, you began to notice smaller truths, a shift in perspective, a warning disguised as hesitation, a peace that arrived without explanation. You learned that guidance does not always descend like thunder. Sometimes it settles like dew, quietly, faithfully, asking only that you pay attention. The noise of urgency faded, and with it the pressure to force outcomes that were never yours to manufacture. There is a hidden discipline formed only in quiet places. Without constant instruction, you learned discernment. Without constant rescue, you learned responsibility. Without constant affirmation, you learned identity. You stopped measuring worth by visible progress and began to recognize growth that could not be displayed. This is where independence from external validation is born, not arrogance but stability. A soul that knows why it stands does not crumble when unseen. Silence also revealed which voices truly mattered. When heaven did not answer audibly, the opinions of others grew louder for a time. Advice conflicted, expectations multiplied, yet eventually even those voices lost their authority. You realize that guidance borrowed from the crowd is unreliable, shifting with trends and fears. What remained was an inner alignment, a compass refined through waiting, calibrated not by popularity but by truth. That inner clarity is not granted quickly, because it cannot be revoked once formed. You may not have recognized it then, but silence was creating space. Space for healing that words would have interrupted. Space for desire to be purified. Space for old ambitions to loosen their grip so that truer ones could emerge. Noise fills every gap immediately. Silence allows the unnecessary to fall away. In that stripping, you were spared futures that would have looked successful but felt hollow. There were moments when you almost filled the quiet yourself. Rushed decisions, premature conclusions, exits justified by exhaustion. Yet something held you back, a restraint you could not fully explain. That restraint was not fear, it was wisdom forming before language caught up with it. You learned that not every unanswered question requires immediate resolution, and not every closed door demands force. Some things open only when pursued without desperation. This did not mean nothing was happening. It meant what was happening was too foundational to be rushed. Structures were being laid that would one day carry weight without strain. Had you received early confirmation, you might have relied on it instead of developing resilience. Had answers come quickly, patience would have remained theoretical rather than lived. The quiet trained you to trust process over impulse, depth over speed. Now, when sound begins to return, when direction feels clearer, when movement feels permitted, you carry something rare. You are no longer dependent on constant signs to proceed. You have learned to walk steadily even when affirmation is delayed. Silence did not weaken you, it calibrated you, and what emerges from such calibration is not easily shaken, because it was not built on noise, but on listening. There comes a point in a long struggle when opposition changes its tone. At first, it is blunt and obvious, meeting you head-on, daring you to retreat. Later it becomes subtle, strategic, almost familiar, as though it has learned your habits and waits patiently for moments of fatigue. This shift is not accidental. Resistance studies what threatens it, and when you reached a certain depth of formation, the resistance around you adjusted, not because you were weakening, but because you were advancing. You may have noticed that the hardest moments did not always arrive at the beginning, but near the moments of clarity. Just when understanding sharpened, confusion followed. Just when peace surfaced, disruption arrived. This pattern unsettled you because it contradicted the expectation that progress would make the path easier. Yet in reality, progress often provokes a response. Opposition does not waste energy on what is stagnant. It reacts to movement hat signals arrival. This is why discouragement often appeared disguised as reason, not a loud voice urging you to quit, but a quiet one suggesting it would be practical. To settle, to lower expectation, to accept less than what your spirit recognized as true. Fatigue was used as evidence, delay as justification, isolation as confirmation. These arguments sounded logical because they were tailored to your temperament. Resistance rarely argues against truth directly. It reframes it as unrealistic, untimely, or unsafe. You were tempted not toward obvious failure, but toward premature resolution. To close the story too soon, to declare the struggle pointless, to redefine endurance as stubbornness. This is the most dangerous form of opposition, because it invites you to participate in your own retreat, while believing you are being wise. Many abandon their calling here, not in despair, but in compromise. You sensed this danger even when you could not articulate it, and something within you refused to settle for explanations that shrank your future. As you matured, opposition lost the ability to frighten you easily, so it attempted to exhaust you instead. Repetition became the weapon. Old fears resurfaced, not because they were still true, but because familiarity breeds credibility. You had faced these battles before, and their return made it seem as though nothing had changed. But repetition does not indicate failure. It often indicates that previous tactics no longer worked, and only echoes remain. What you were learning, slowly and painfully, was discernment. The ability to distinguish between a genuine warning and a recycled threat, between conviction and condemnation, between humility and self-erasure. This discernment is not taught through instruction alone, it is earned through exposure. Each time you resisted surrendering your identity, each time you questioned the narrative being presented to you, your clarity strengthened. Opposition also attempted isolation, not always by removing people, but by creating the feeling of being fundamentally misunderstood. You could be surrounded and still feel alone. This was not to punish you, but to test whether your sense of purpose depended on agreement. When affirmation faded, when recognition stalled, you had to decide whether obedience required witnesses. You discovered that truth remains true even when it is not echoed back. There is a reason the pressure increased as you neared alignment. Systems resist disruption, patterns resist change. Your growth threatened structures built on your silence, your compliance, your self-doubt. As you became less predictable, less reactive, less dependent, tension followed. This tension was not a sign that you were wrong, it was evidence that something was shifting. You also learned that not all resistance is external. Some of the fiercest opposition arose from within, old identities demanding familiarity, habits resisting release, narratives insisting on relevance. Letting go of who you were expected to be can feel like betrayal, even when it is necessary. Yet you chose transformation over comfort, truth over nostalgia. That choice. CE was costly, but it was decisive. What sustained you was not constant victory, but growing awareness. You began to recognize patterns without being ruled by them. You faced resistance without dramatizing it. You stopped interpreting every obstacle as a verdict. This quiet authority marked a turning point. Opposition had not vanished, but it had lost its power to define reality. When resistance intensifies near the end, it is not announcing your defeat, it is revealing its deadline. It knows when its influence is expiring. You were never meant to fight endlessly, but to pass through, carrying with you the discernment formed in the struggle. What once threatened to stop you became the instrument that trained you to stand, and in standing, you moved beyond its reach. There is a quiet moment that arrives after long endurance, when the heart begins to sense release before the mind can explain it. Nothing dramatic announces it. Circumstances may look largely the same, and yet something within loosens. The grip of urgency softens. The constant readiness for impact fades. You realize that you are no longer bracing in the same way. This is often the first sign that a season's authority has expired, even if its memory still lingers. For a long time, your identity was shaped in reaction to pressure. You learned who you were by what you had to survive. Strength became second nature because weakness was never afforded the luxury of lingering. Yet survival, while necessary, is not mean to be permanent. A soul can endure war and still be unprepared for peace. The habits that protected you in battle can become burdens when the battle ends. Release requires a different kind of courage than endurance ever did. You may have noticed a strange discomfort when calm appeared. Not fear exactly, but uncertainty. Without constant opposition to define your posture, you are left to confront who you are, without resistance as a mirror. This is unsettling for those who have lived long in struggle. Peace can feel undeserved, unearned, or temporary. Yet this discomfort is not a warning, it is an invitation to lay down weapons that are no longer required. Heaven does not simply remove struggle, it teaches the chosen how to release it. Otherwise, the battle continues internally, long after external circumstances have shifted. You are not being trained merely to survive difficulty, but to recognize when difficulty no longer had permission to rule you. Discernment is needed not only to stand firm, but to stand down when the time arrives. There were moments when you could have continued fighting out of habit alone. Old reflexes urged vigilance. Old narratives insisted that if you relaxed, loss would follow. Yet gradually you learned to pause without panic, to rest without guilt, to stop proving your worth through constant resistance. This was not weakness, it was alignment. Rest is not retreat when the assignment has been fulfilled. Release also required forgiveness, not on lie of others, but of yourself, for the decisions made under pressure, for the compromises born of fear, for the seasons where clarity came late. Carrying self-judgment beyond its usefulness would have tethered you to a past that no longer defined your direction. Letting go did not erase responsibility, it restored proportion. You learned to view your story with mercy instead of condemnation. As the struggle loosened its hold, space emerged. Space for new desires to surface. Space for joy that did not require justification. Space for creativity, connection, and vision that had been postponed by necessity. You realized that your heart had not been emptied by endurance, it had been preserved. What felt like loss was actually conservation, protecting what mattered until the right season arrived. Release also meant allowing others to see you differently. Some were accustomed to your resilience, your availability, your role as stabilizer. Change disrupted their expectations. Boundaries were misunderstood. Quiet was mistaken for withdrawal. Yet you could no longer live as a response to other people's needs alone. Maturity demanded that you honor the season you had entered, even when it required disappointing those who preferred the version of you shaped by struggle. There is humility in release. It acknowledges that effort alone does not govern timing, that willpower cannot extend a season beyond its purpose, that knowing when to stop is as sacred as knowing when to press on. You were learning to trust completion rather than control, surrender rather than strain. This release did not arrive as a single moment, but as a gradual permission to exhale, permission to hope without bracing for loss, permission to imagine a future not defined by repair. You did not abandon vigilance, you redefined it. Watchfulness shifted from guarding against harm to recognizing opportunity. The end of struggle is rarely loud. It does not announce itself with celebration or explanation. It settles quietly, waiting to see if you will accept it. And acceptance for someone shaped by endurance is an act of faith. To believe that the season has truly changed, to trust that you are allowed to move forward unarmed. In learning to release, you honored the struggle without remaining bound to it, and prepared yourself for what could only be received with open hands. There is a moment when forward movement no longer feels like escape, but like arrival, not because everything is resolved, but because direction becomes clear without being forced. You are no longer running from what was, nor striving to prove what will be. You are simply moving in alignment, and alignment carries a quiet authority of its own. This is what follows sealing, not stagnation, but permission. For a long time, progress required effort that bordered on strain. Every step demanded explanation, defense, or justification. You had to convince yourself as much as anyone else that continuing was worth a while. Now, motion feels different. It is not frantic. It does not demand constant validation. It unfolds with steadiness, as though the path itself has agreed to meet you halfway. Ease is not the absence of responsibility. It is the absence of resistance that once opposed your obedience. You may have expected the future to announce itself with clarity so sharp it left no room for doubt. Instead, it arrived as coherence. Pieces that once felt disconnected began to relate to one another. Experiences that seemed wasted revealed their relevance. Skills developed in isolation found context. Nothing was discarded. Everything was gathered. This is how purpose often reveals itself, not as something new, but as something finely integrated. Forward movement also carries a new kind of accountability. When struggle dominated, survival justified inconsistency. Exhaustion excused delay. Now that the burden has lifted, intention matters more. You are not driven by fear of loss, but by responsibility to what has been entrusted to you. This responsibility is quieter, but heavier in its own way. It asks not how much you can endure, but how faithfully you can steward what has been given. You are also learning to move without over-explaining. In the past, misunderstanding demanded defense. Now, clarity within you reduces the need for constant correction. Not everyone will understand the direction you take, but understanding is no longer the prerequisite for obedience. Confidence rooted in alignment does not argue, it proceeds. Silence becomes a form of certainty rather than a sign of doubt. The future you step into does not erase your past, it redeems it. The empathy you carry, the patience you learned, the discernment you earned, all become functional. You are no longer defined by what you survived, but informed by it. Pain becomes reference rather than residence. Memory becomes wisdom rather than weight. This transformation is subtle but decisive. It marks the difference between healing and merely coping. As you move forward, you may notice an increased sensitivity to what does not belong. Environments, expectations, and relationships that once felt tolerable now feel heavy. This is not arrogance, it is attunement. Alignment sharpens perception. What once blended into the background now stands out, not to condemn, but to guide. You are being trained to choose based on resonance rather than pressure. There will still be challenges, but they will not carry the same authority. Difficulty may arise, but it will not define the season. You will recognize the difference between growth that stretches and struggle that drains. Discernment allows you to invest effort where it bears fruit, rather than where it merely maintains old cycles. This selectivity is not avoidance, it is maturity. Forward movement also invites contribution. What you carry is no longer solely for your own survival. It has application beyond you, the steadiness you embody, the clarity you express, the restraint you practice. These influence more than you realize. Leadership does not always appear as position, often it manifests as presence. People sense when someone moves from wholeness rather than reaction. You may feel moments of hesitation, not from fear, but from awareness. Awareness of consequence. Awareness of impact. This is healthy. It reflects a shift from impulsive striving to thoughtful stewardship. You are not rushing toward outcomes. You are walking into responsibility with eyes open. The sealing of a chapter does not end the story. It redirects it. What lies ahead will require your full attention, but not your former defenses. You move now, not as one trying to escape the past, but as one released from it. Each step forward confirms what the silence, the resistance, the endurance, and the release were preparing you for. You are not beginning again, you are continuing, this time without chains, into a future that responds not to struggle, but to alignment.